Hello, everyone, and welcome to Professor Katie Mack of North Carolina State University is visiting us here today at UC San Diego and has generously agreed to be a podcast guest on the Arthur C. Clarke Center for Human Imagination's Into the Impossible podcast. And I thank you very much for doing that. And you following not too long on the heels of your former PhD advisor, Professor Paul Steinhardt, Princeton University. So first, I wanted to ask you, what brings you to San Diego today?
Your invitation brings me to San Diego today.
You need to escape.
So I'm giving a talk at 3 p.m. about my dark matter research. I drove down from Los Angeles because I've been visiting JPL and my family up in that area.
Oh, okay. Oh, I didn't know you're from North. You got family here.
Yeah.
Oh, great. Good to time it. And what is it like in North Carolina? You've been there, you were in Australia, right, beforehand?
Yeah.
What's that change been like?
It's been different. So I was away from the US for 8 years. So I was in England for 3 years and then Australia for 5. And I just got back a little over a year ago. So it's been an adjustment to be back in the States all of a sudden, and I had to buy healthcare and stuff like that. But it's good. The new job is great. So I'm in the physics department, assistant professor of physics tenure track, and I'm also part of this new initiative there called the Leadership in Public Science Cluster, and it's all about getting together people who do some kind of public science, so citizen science, open science, science communication, and having us work together on new initiatives and kind of just see what we can do to make new connections between science and the public.
Is that an NC State initiative, or is that like a part of the the mission of the state of North Carolina?
No, it's an NC State thing. So it's funded through like the provost office, and it's a dedicated initiative to do more public science.
Will there be a research component? Will you be researching how the public interacts with science, or how to improve how we communicate?
So there's the cluster. So it's a cluster. There's 5 of us in the public science cluster. So there are a couple of projects within the cluster that we're all sort of contributing to in some way that have a connection with that. So we've looked at things like how getting people into citizen science might affect like their identity with science, for example, as scientists. So we have a few things proposed to try to kind of try new things and see if we can really get some quantitative data on that.
Yeah, I've seen a couple of citizen science initiatives lately. We actually were involved with one related to the New Horizons project. Personally, I wondered how much of it was sort of public relations for the scientists versus actually citizen science, participation. What in your mind are some of the more successful examples of public engagement in science where scientists are actually benefiting from interaction with the public and vice versa?
So Galaxy Zoo is a great example because you can sign up to go and look at galaxies from the survey that they've done, and it's an automated survey, and they have a bunch of sources, and you tell it like what kind of galaxy it looks like it might be, and if there's anything weird about it, and then they use that data to look at like populations of galaxies and how they evolve over time, and they found some like weird new phenomena that way, and so it's been this fantastic like data set that people have directly contributed to, and and it's not just like just sort of give a classification. Like people get involved in like learning about the science and occasionally find something really interesting, and then they can potentially be like part of that discovery. And so it's been a neat thing to watch how that goes.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. We had Brooke Simmons was here for a long time, and she's faculty currently. The question of how to engage scientists. I mean, for a long time, the American Association of Variable Star Observers was an organization that actually had a lot of publications, and amateurs would get involved in science. But it was less than citizen science, more kind of really passionate amateur astronomers. So it is sort of a new age. I guess SETI at home was another successful example in some minds, right?
Yeah. Although SETI at home is different because you just let your computer do a thing. You don't actually interact with it directly. I think things like Galaxy Zoo are effective because you actually are like looking at the data yourself. You're actually like interacting with it and making judgments and learning about it in a way that just lending your processing time is not doing.
When you were a young person, what sorts of scientific interests were most close to your heart? Do you think was it astronomy always as a little young person?
No, I got into it through physics, more than astronomy. So I grew up in Los Angeles. The sky there is not great.
Yes, that's an understatement, I think. Well, it was quite good about 150 years ago.
Yeah,
I'm told.
I don't know. So I didn't grow up like staring at the night sky or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But I was always interested in like how things work, and I would take apart electronics and figure out what was going on and put them back together and build little things and do experiments. Like I was always interested in that kind of thing. And at some point, like I was really interested in things like science fiction, and at some point I discovered like people like Stephen Hawking and Paul Davies who were writing books about like time and space and time travel and black holes and stuff like that. And I just got really excited about those topics, and I went to some public lectures. Being in LA was great because people come through and give talks, and I went to I saw Stephen Hawking speak a couple of times when I was young, and so that was really great.
Yeah.
And
the
then,
real stars of Los Angeles.
Yeah. And so I think by the time I was about 10 years old, I was reading Brief History of Time, and I was like, I want to do what this person does. And I found out that he was called a cosmologist, so I was like, okay, I want to be a cosmologist. That's what I want to do. So it was very much through the sort of physics, cosmology side rather than through astronomy.
Uh-huh. And you, speaking of Stephen Hawking, have undertaken a project which was very near and dear to Stephen Hawking's career and life and legacy, which is to write a popular science book. Mm. And I understand that from what you're saying now and from other things I've read and researched about you, that he was a big influence on you. Mm. And it's interesting, I went back and read the Brief History of Time after he died as an homage to his life and work. And it's funny because you look at and reading it, there's so many passages where he does the dangerous thing that cosmologists do, which is to predict what's going to be discovered in the near future. And most, if not all, of what he was predicting turned out not to be currently in favor, which is fine. That happens in science. But you, in your book, as I understand it, and I'd like you to describe it if you wouldn't mind, you're venturing way out on a limb in many ways, because you're not predicting how things will be in a decade or, after you get tenure and beyond, but you're talking about the real deep future. Why don't you explain that to the listeners?
So I've been thinking about writing a book for a while and thinking about like what kind of topic I wanted to cover. And one of the things I most enjoy talking about in terms of like public talks and stuff like that is the end of the universe, mm-hmm. like how it's all going to end, what's going to happen in different weird ways for the universe to end. And so I thought that would be a really good topic for a book because there are lots of books about the beginning of the universe, and there aren't very many about the end.
Right.
And it's a fun place. It's a fun place to look at right now because there's a lot of research in that area, but it's not certain, mm-hmm. So we don't really know what's going to happen, and there are a few different possibilities that are still in play. And so what I'm doing is writing about like 5 different possible ends for the universe and what they would look like and what would happen and how, like, what evidence we have for or against those possibilities and how we're going to figure it out, mm-hmm. In the next few decades or whatever.
So right now we're in the office that was once occupied by the late, great Jeffrey Burbidge, who with his very formidable wife, Margaret Burbidge, were some of the leading founders of the Center for Astrophysics and Space Sciences here. And as you know, he didn't believe the universe really had a Big Bang origin and sort of went to his grave. I hosted many cosmologists such as yourself coming here, and he would be polite but rude at the same time to these great men and women. I wonder, how do you deal with, because you must get a lot of kind of ideas thrown at you, shall we say, that are a little bit not in the mainstream. How do you approach it? How do you treat something which may sound crazy or may sound definitely unorthodox, but sometimes great ideas come from those directions? How do you approach kind of the going out of the mainstream, and or do you think that's important to consider things that aren't, kind of in the herd?
So what do you mean out of the mainstream?
Well, so for example, the dominant paradigm of very early universe cosmology is inflation, and there are some people, your former thesis advisor included, who conjecture that not only are such hypotheses wrong and wrong-headed, they're actually bad for science, and there should be other alternatives. But yet they seem to have a monopoly on the way that physicists think, such to the extent that it becomes hard for young people to get jobs in the field or get attention in the field who may not be carrying the torch or in the mainstream. So does the same thing happen, say, in thinking about the end of the universe? As you said, your book is very different. It's not about the beginning; it's about the end. Are there theories? Is there same level of controversy surrounding what will happen in the deep future? And if so, what's your reaction to those kinds?
So I don't know. I mean, have you seen people not able to get jobs because they worked on periodic cosmology or something like that? Has that been something you've observed?
I've heard claims that people have said that it's very difficult to get jobs, and and I've had this debate with Paul as well to say that well, it's one thing to do something completely new, but you should also understand everything about what comes before, even if it disagrees with your hypothesis. I mean, to take a classic example, the steady state for many years was felt to be much more palatable because it could be disproven, it could be falsified. Whereas the Big Bang seemed like, every time there was a new observation, things would change to match those observations, including the expansion rate of the universe, changing from year to year, the temperature of the CMB changing.
Well, the Big Bang doesn't require a specific expansion rate. It just requires a hot, dense early universe. So that was, as soon as we found the CMB, that was pretty clear.
Yeah. So I guess the claim that I've heard is that, especially with and we actually talked about this on the podcast not too long ago. When you have kind of the instantaneous ability to maybe put it unkindly, attack an idea or assail an idea before the theorist or thinker has a chance to really flesh it out. They're just presenting things. I think the claim is sometimes you need a little bit of time to work through an alternative idea before you actually are ready to take it public. But if you don't agree with somewhat, I'm thinking of people like Sabine Hasselfelder, who's made a claim that at least in particle physics there seems to be this obsession with the quest for mathematical elegance and beauty, and that, according to her at least, is sort of responsible for a little bit of a herd mentality in particle physics. I don't know so much if that's true of end of the universe cosmology, but I guess getting back to the original question, what do you see as the role that kind of, because there seems to be multiple possibilities for what you're describing in your book, 5 different possible endings. I mean, would you ascribe a probability of one of those being more correct, less correct, more palatable in some sense, or less?
I mean, I think there are varying levels of evidence for different possibilities. The same with any area of physics. I think that in my experience, in my field, what tends to happen is that anytime a new idea is put forward, it's scrutinized, and it should be, and it's scrutinized very strongly. And if it doesn't fit the data as well as the previous model, then it's put aside. And if at some point it fits the data better, then people gradually shift over to the new paradigm. And that seems to be how it's been going within the course of my career anyway, in the areas I work in. And I think that's perfectly fine and healthy. I think there are always going to be people who get really caught up in a bad idea and try and tweak things to fit that notion. But I haven't found, I don't know, I think that some of the worries about oh no, it's a herd mentality are really just the fact that people take a practical approach to, we have a lot of evidence for this model, there are things to test about it, let's continue testing this model. This other idea that isn't fully fleshed out, that's just kind of oh, I have this notion, you don't know what to do with that. And if it doesn't fit the data as well, you don't know what to, then it doesn't make sense to put a huge amount of effort into that until it's fleshed out or until it does actually give you a better model, So So I'm sure there are people who are irrational about this stuff, but I think that sometimes those kinds of worries get a little bit like exaggerated by people who fear that they're being unfairly treated by the establishment. And I mean, based on a lot of the emails I get, there are a lot of people who feel that they're being unfairly treated by the establishment in terms of like, I have this idea, why isn't anybody, engaging with my idea? And usually it's because it's not something that's like easy to test, or it's not something that's fully developed. And so, you can only spend so much of your time working on something where it's not a clear, straightforward question. Getting back to end of the universe stuff, I mean, in my book, I'm looking at 5 different possibilities. One of them is the Big Crunch, which is probably not going to happen, in the sense that the universe is accelerating its expansion. It seems very difficult for it to turn around and fall back again. But I talk about it because it's something that was historically, it looked more plausible than the other alternatives, and now we have better data that shows it's probably not going to happen, but we can't say for certain that dark energy might not sort of turn around and become something else. And so, you present it as a possibility. And then, I talk about the heat death, I talk about the big rip, I talk about a few different things as things where we don't know for sure, and here's what it would look like, and here's the data that would support it or not, and here are reasons why people are interested in it. So I don't say like, this is the one that's definitely going to happen. At no point do I do that. But I do talk about where we're finding data for or against, and how we evaluate these theories, and why we might shift from one to another as being the more favored model. So, right now, I think that the consensus view is that probably we're heading toward the heat death, which is where dark energy just makes the universe really, really big, and everything dilutes, and you end up with a dark, empty, cold universe, right? And that just kind of persists. And that's
keep paying your taxes because it's not going to happen for a while, right?
I mean, it'll take a while. In a sense, it's already happening. If you're in a void in the universe, then you're already sort of
tenuously.
Yeah. But in our region of the universe, our stars are going to die for another few billion years. But anyway, so you get so that's considered the sort of current default hypothesis, because it seems like a very clear extrapolation from what's happening now, and it's a model that we basically can understand. Dark energy being a cosmological constant, we don't know why it would be a cosmological constant, but it's very simple in the equations, and that's dark energy where the universe just expands, and eventually you get a heat death. But then I talk about, for example, the Big Rip, where you have a kind of dark energy that's a little bit more exotic, and gets more powerful over time, and sort of rips apart galaxies and planets and people and all of that. And that's kind of a more sort of exciting model, but there are reasons why theorists are not as excited about it. One of them is it's a little bit more complicated than a cosmological constant. Another is that there are sort of issues with energy conditions that such a kind of field or whatever would have. So, but in terms of the data, it doesn't fit the data less well than the cosmological constant. Sometimes it fits better. So, there are different ways to look at these things, and at the moment we can't fully distinguish between those two possibilities. But it makes sense that by and large, the community is going to say, well, this one has fewer sort of weird theoretical problems with it, so let's stick with this for now.
It seems more palatable to some. Yeah, exactly. So that's certainly a sensible way to approach it. And again, to commend you on doing what Yogi Berra implored us not to do, and that it's very difficult to make predictions, especially about the future and the end of the universe being the most distant future one could imagine. So I want to close today with a couple of questions. One was submitted by a fan of the podcast, and she asked me to ask you, what are some of the ways that we can encourage more young women, especially women, to enter into STEM fields, and especially perhaps physics and astronomy?
I mean, I'm not a sociologist, so a better person to ask would be a sociologist, somebody who actually studies this topic. I think that for women and, especially for women of color and for other people of color and for gender and sexual minorities, for people with disabilities, for people with, mental health issues or not being neurotypical, there are all sorts of ways in which the environment of academia and other academics can be hostile to people. And I think that the important thing is to reduce those kinds of barriers, to change the attitude of academia, of just society in general, toward people who don't fit a stereotype of what a scientist is. I think those things are much more important than, painting a circuit board pink or whatever these kinds of things that people try and do. Because I think that people are interested in science. I think a lot of people are interested in science and are discouraged from doing science because of various kinds of societal barriers. So I think that it's important to address those things, and it's important to make sure that people who are in positions of power and in positions of privilege are working to reduce those barriers.
So with the final question, irrespective of which particular subgroups, just in general, as an educator yourself, one of the things I'm most fascinated with, and one of the themes that always comes up on the podcast with all our guests, is the notion of imagination and curiosity. And I wonder, if you think, or how you think of this question of teaching curiosity or teaching imagination. Is it something you think is innate? It sounds like you were driven from a pretty young age with a curiosity and a thirst to understand physics and the universe. But can it be something that's taught, or is it, like being a physician or something like that, or a craft, or is it something that is less tangible and there's no, in your opinion, direct path to pedagogy to teach the subject of, or the ability to be curious or use one's imagination in a way that's effective towards increasing scientific knowledge?
I mean, I think definitely curiosity can be taught and encouraged, and the way that we teach physics and other sciences can be more exploratory. I think those are all important goals, and there's a whole body of literature about about pedagogy, about how we teach science and how we teach it in order to encourage people to be active learners and to get really engaged with the subject. And, again, a lot of it is just not discouraging people. And I was fortunate that when I was growing up, my family was very supportive of me, tinkering all the time and, going to lectures and to the observatory and just exploring what I was interested in. And I also had the time and the freedom to do that in a way that not people don't always have, and I was fortunate enough to have the, financial ability to go to a summer camp about space. A lot of people can't do that. So I think that, when people are not encumbered by other sort of pressures, and when people are encouraged to follow their passions, I think that you get a lot more ability for people to explore their creativity. And I think that creativity can be taught as if we change how we talk about how people do science, and if we change how we introduce people to science. I think that that's a big part of that. But I think for a lot of these things, it's a matter of giving people the time and space to really explore.
And then nurturing that aspect. Yeah, great. Okay, well, I want to close with ways that you can find Professor Katie Mack online. Are there ways people can find out more about you and your work?
Yeah, so my website is astrokatie.com. I'm on Twitter as @astrokatie. I'm on Facebook at facebook.com/astrokatie, and I'm on Instagram as academic nomad because Astrokatie was taken.
And it was true. I remember trying to, assign as a homework problem to calculate Katie Mack's average velocity, because you were always picturing yourself on a plane. But it sounds like you've settled down a little bit more, at least on the East Coast. Although you are still traveling.
I'm traveling a lot this year, but yeah, it's nice to have a faculty job and have a chance to kind of stay in one place for a while.
Absolutely. Great. Well, thank you so much for being here and joining us on the Into the Impossible podcast with today's special guest, Professor Keating Mack, and look forward to future discoveries and especially to your book next year. Thank you.